Okay, so the idea of a nomological network is akin to the idea of sensory quintangulation, let's call it that. And so everyone knows that we have 5 senses. Now, each of those senses uses a qualitatively different strategy of measurement, right? Somewhat independently evolved. And so our proposition as embodied biological organisms is that if something manifests itself simultaneously in the domains covered by the 5 dimensions of our senses, it's real, right? So what's real? You can taste it, you can touch it, you can see it, you can hear it, you can feel it. If you can do all 5 of those, then there's a pretty damn good chance that it's real. Now, actually, that turned out not to be real enough. And that's partly why the development of language had some adaptive utility, because you and I can communicate, I can use your 5 senses transmitted to me through the linguistic domain to calibrate my 5 senses, and then we can do that en masse, and to a large degree, that's what science does. All right, so you take multiple independent sources of measurement, and if they converge, then you assume that there's something there. Fair enough so far?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay. I would say, from what I've been able to understand, that that's what the Jungians did in their archetypal analysis. Now, you can debate, as the postmodernists have, about whether or not what they found was spurious. But in my Maps of Meaning book, what I tried to do was to take what the Jungians had discovered by constructing a nomological network of cross-cultural mythological analysis,
Yes.
and I tried to beat that against the measurement techniques of behavioral psychology and neuroscience. And I found, at least I claimed in that book, to have found like a substantive, non-trivial, and surprising degree of overlap. So let me, and I think this is relevant to your book on happiness. Now, you tell me what you think about this, because happiness doesn't just mean transitory hedonic joy. And you certainly don't think that, because that isn't how you live. So the core element of the hero archetype is the injunction that you should advance courageously in the face of threat, if said threat stands as an obstacle between you and a valid goal.
Yes.
Right. And so that's different than rabbit mythology, which would be when you see a wolf, freeze. The human myth is, no. When you encounter a threat, you explore it until you master it. Okay, right. And as far as I can tell, all the variants of hero mythology are basically that, right? It's the dragon fight, is that you find the terrible predator, and that's what a dragon is. It's an emblem of the predator. And you encounter that voluntarily, and as a consequence, you get the virgin, so that's on the sexual front, and you get the gold, and that's on the material front. And so, the Jungians, to their credit, and I really do think to their credit, pointed out that underlying narrative structure makes itself manifest cross-culturally in a multitude of forms. Now, unfortunately, to understand that, you have to throw yourself pretty deeply into that body of research, right? And it's pretty arcane, and Jung thought symbolically, and so he's not a thinker who's particularly amenable to people whose primary mode of thought is rational rather than pattern recognition. Mm-hmm. Right. So, right. But like, I do think the Jungians used a nomological network, and I think that the core religious doctrine that they converged on was something like the universal validity of the hero myth and the redemptive quality of that courageous advancement in the face of the unknown. And so that's a place where you could, because your question was, well, there's all these competing religious claims, right? And I'd say, well, there's no way I can offer a contrary perspective to that viewpoint, given the multitude of contradictory religious claims. But then I would say there's a hierarchy of claims, and some of them are more central. And there is a convergence at the level of what claims are most central. And I think the convergence is analogous to your proposition that you should abide by the truth in your exploration and your communicative enterprise. And I think that's associated with the kind of happiness that you're writing about in your new book. right? A kind of deep
Right.
happiness.
Right. I mean, I agree largely with all that you've said about the universal myths that the Jungians talk about. And again, there have been many studies from an evolutionary perspective that look, for example, that if I want to study female sexuality, the best way to study it is to do a archetypal analysis of the male hero in romance novels. And it turns out that the male hero in romance novels is the exact same guy in every single romance novel that has ever been written. I mean, to the point that you would think it's been plagiarized. He is tall, to my detriment, since I'm not tall. He wrestles alligators on his six-pack and wins. He is a surgeon and a prince. He's reckless in his behavior, but he could only be tamed by the love of one woman.
Right.
And so I just described every single
Beauty and the Beast. Yeah, it's
exactly.
Beauty and the Beast.
So,
yeah.
And so these archetypal narratives are universal precisely because they are an indelible part of human nature. And that manifestation exists independently of whether you believe in the supernatural origin of those stories or not. But if I can just quickly segue into my forthcoming book. So I do talk about religiosity and happiness in my forthcoming book. And you and many other folks who are very pro-religion will be happy to know that the research shows, and I know that you probably know this, that there is a moderate correlation between religiosity and happiness, meaning that on average, people who are more religious tend to manifest higher happiness scores. But we can discuss why that is. Now, I argue that that doesn't mean, though, that if you're not religious, you can't find your way to mount happiness. And I can couch it in a divine language. So you and I are right now engaging in an intoxicating conversation that is truly divine, right? Friendships are divine, as Aristotle said, and as I describe in my book. The love that you have for your children and your wife is a form of, divine love. Having purpose and meaning in your chosen profession, I talk about that in the book. I basically argue that the two most important decisions that either make you happy or incredibly miserable is choosing the right spouse and choosing the right profession. If you make those two choices correctly, you're well on your way to being a happy
That was
person.
Freud's observation, right? Work and love. That was his prescription for a meaningful existence.
Exactly. Yeah. And look, and he said it 100 years ago, and I've said it today, precisely because they are universal truths, to our earlier point. One of the things that I did in this book is really delve into the ancient Greeks, Epictetus and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. And here I want to point to a quip that my fellow Lebanese friend Nassim Taleb once told me, which turns out to be hauntingly true. He once was teasing me that he said, I don't know what you study in psychology, Gad, because everything that there is to know about human nature, the ancient Greeks have already said. And now he was quipping me, he was teasing me. But as I started delving into that literature, I said, I think Nassim might be right, because I would get some insight, for example, about the link between cognitive behavior therapy and some other mechanism of happiness and so on. And then I find out that Epictetus had made that exact point over 2,000 years ago. So I think that there are these universal truths that exist, whether it is in how we seek happiness or in any other domain of human import, that are universal precisely because they are an indelible part of our human nature. I mean, that's why I love evolutionary psychology so much, because it is very difficult to have powerful explanations of human behavior void of an evolutionary understanding of our species. And so it always amazes me that people exhibit an animus to evolutionary psychology. What else could it be? Like, where did your brain come from if you take it outside of the purview of evolutionary theory?